They entered the chapel at dawn, expecting silence. What they found was an altar soaked in wax and blood. The candles had burned to stumps, their smoke still curling. Chains swung gently from the ceiling, as if recently disturbed. The walls were damp with condensation, or was it sweat? Above the desecrated altar, a crucifix hung upside down, its wooden Christ carved with a gaping mouth. There was no sign of the woman who ruled this place, no footsteps in the mud, no horses gone missing, only what she left behind. Scripture etched into the stone, lashes buried in the floorboards, hymns written in flesh. In the cells below, girls sat in silence, some blind, some tongueless, all changed. This was not a place of God. This was a place of offering, and its high priestess had vanished. They called her Elizabeth of Palatinate, born of nobility, veiled in piety. But this was no saint. This was something far more terrifying. A woman who believed pain could purify the soul, and silence could summon the divine. She didn't lose her mind. She sharpened it into a weapon, and she used it to carve her gospel into living bodies. What she left behind was not madness, it was scripture. She was born behind golden doors, a daughter of the house of Palatinate, baptized in wine, christened beneath chandeliers. Her crib was lined with lace and Latin prayers. But before she could speak, they said she watched, not like a child, not with wonder, but with the stillness of a judge. The nuns called her devout, the priests called her chosen. She called herself empty, waiting to be filled. As a girl, her playthings were shaped like people, small figures of wax and straw, with twine around the neck and needles in their bellies. She tied them to bedposts. She read them verses. When they melted in the sun, she wept, not for their loss, but for the imperfections in their design. At 10, she entered the convent. At 14, she led its prayers, and by 17, she ruled it. The convent of St. Agidia, once a haven for noble girls, became something else under her hand. The crosses were polished, the candles always lit, the hymns sung in perfect pitch, but beneath the marble, something was wrong. The girls did not smile, they did not speak. Their eyes trembled like oil on water. They were beautiful, pale, obedient, too obedient. They bowed too low, they prayed too long. They walked like they were afraid of their own footsteps. Outside, the world called her a saint, a visionary, a daughter of divine order, but the girls inside knew better. They whispered it through broken teeth and bitten tongues. We were not her students, we were her offerings. The gates of St. Agidia closed with a sound that echoed like a verdict. Parents left with peace in their hearts, noblemen and baronesses smiling as they entrusted their daughters to the care of the Blessed Elizabeth. Girls arrived with silk ribbons in their hair, clutching prayer books, eyes wide with hope. They expected scripture, discipline, maybe a bit of strictness, but not chains, not blood. At first it all seemed holy. The marble hallways were lined with icons, the choir sang like angels, and Elizabeth, dressed in flawless white with a gold crucifix around her throat, moved like a ghost of the Virgin herself. She never raised her voice, she never showed anger. Her punishments were silent, clinical, wrapped in scripture. The early discipline was harsh but explainable. Cold fasts, kneeling for hours, forbidden speech, but they escalated quickly. A girl named Latte spoke during evening prayer, just a whisper to ask for a candle. The next morning she returned to the chapel limping. Her hands shook as she genuflected. Her eyes were bloodshot and blank. No one ever heard her speak again. Elizabeth claimed she was purging sin. That silence was the language of the divine. But in truth, she had begun to shape the convent like a sculpture, chipping away until only obedience remained. Beneath her bed she kept a wooden chest locked with iron clasps. Some girls saw it open during rituals. Inside were ropes, metal cuffs, curved blades, and a set of bone-handled needles wrapped in linen, embroidered with crosses. Her Bible, too, was different, pages stiff with candle wax and marked in blood-red ink. Certain verses were underlined with manic precision. I discipline my body and bring it into subjection. Through pain we are purified. Blessed are those who suffer in silence. She did not beat the girls. That would have been too crude. Instead, she engineered their pain like a composer. Some were made to kneel on dry rice for hours, their legs going numb. Others fasted until they collapsed, only to be revived with freezing water and returned to their stations. Elizabeth called it tempering, like steel in fire. In the sanctuary, a strange scent began to linger. Not incense, but something coppery beneath it. Iron, sweat, decay, a mixture that did not belong in a place of prayer. The girls began to whisper, but not to each other, only to the crucifix. They begged silently, not for salvation but for escape. Then came the masks. During days of reflection, Elizabeth would cover the faces of the girls with linen veils, binding them with scripture tied around their heads. "You must forget yourselves," she would say, pacing through the room, her voice barely above a whisper. "The flesh is loud. Silence it." No one dared question her. Even the senior nuns bowed lower than the girls. Even the visitors, bishops, wealthy donors, distant relatives, were carefully shown only the manicured surface, the perfect hymns, the unblemished faces, the polished stone. But behind the walls a ritual was growing, one stitched in scripture and sharpened with bone. The transformation of the convent was not a sudden horror. It was slow, like rot beneath a floorboard. Every girl who returned changed, said nothing. Every girl who disappeared was explained away. Her father recalled her. She fell ill. She found another calling. But the names never returned to the registry, and the dormitory grew quieter with each season. One girl, Celeste, wrote letters to her family. Beautiful letters about faith, growth, humility. Her parents were proud, but they never knew those letters were written at knife point, while a nun pressed a crucifix against her bruised spine. They never saw the blood on her pillow. They never heard the screams that were allowed only in the crypt, where the stone was thick and the world couldn't listen. By the end of the year, the prayer room had no benches, only stones and broken glass. The choir sang hymns that made no sense, verses rewritten in a language that sounded like Latin but twisted, a new gospel authored in secret. And still Elizabeth smiled. Her lips moved in prayer, her hands folded delicately as she passed from cell to cell, reciting blessings, laying fingers on bruises like a mother. But in her wake the girls trembled. One nun, an older woman named Sister Benedetta, tried to intervene, to send word to the bishop. She was found days later in the orchard, her wrists slit, a smile carved into her face. The death was ruled a suicide, and the lessons continued. To the outside world, Elizabeth remained a prodigy, a miracle in silk. But inside St. Agidia, the truth became a liturgy carved in bruises and whispered between broken teeth. She said our pain made her closer to God. The seasons changed, but the light inside the convent never did. It remained cold, filtered through narrow panes of stained glass that cast the chapel in shades of crimson and bruise. Elizabeth said that color was sacred, the hues of penance. Girls learned to bow in red light, to speak only in prayer, and to keep their eyes lowered. It wasn't humility, it was survival. The punishments were no longer just correction, they became ritual. The cells were stripped bare, meals were reduced to broth and bread, beds were replaced with stone slabs, and each morning before sunrise, the bell rang 3 times, calling the girls not to worship but to offering. One by one they were brought to the sanctum. There, beneath the altar, was a narrow room lit only by candles arranged in a perfect circle. In the center stood Elizabeth. Her robes were always spotless, her hands always gloved. Around her, silent nuns held buckets, rags, irons, tools of her new theology. If a girl confessed to dreaming during prayer, she would be bound to a kneeler laced with thorns and made to recite verses until her knees bled. If she dared to question, her tongue was clamped, her fingers broken beneath the weight of the psalms. And yet many didn't confess willingly. They were made to. One girl, Maria, tried to escape. She slipped from the convent walls in the dead of night, barefoot, wearing only a shift. She was caught at sunrise, frozen, her toes blue. Elizabeth ordered her baptized, a ritual of penance that involved being submerged in a barrel of icy water while the nuns sang prayers of purification. When she was pulled out, she could no longer walk. But she thanked Elizabeth with trembling lips. "You saved me from myself," she whispered. The other girls watched in horror. Maria was not broken, she was transformed. Then came the days of darkness. For an entire week the windows of the convent were covered. No light, no warmth. Girls were forbidden to speak, eat, or sleep more than 2 hours. During this time Elizabeth taught her most sacred doctrine, not in words but in deeds. She would visit each girl's cell alone, speaking softly, calling them little martyrs. Some she marked with ash, others with fire. Each one left her presence changed, quieter, more hollow. It wasn't long before a priest took notice. Father Matias, a traveling friar, arrived at the convent to deliver winter supplies and blessings. He was received with warmth and ceremony. The girls were dressed in their finest. The meals were elaborate. Elizabeth smiled like a saint. But beneath it all, Matias sensed unease. He watched the girls. Their eyes flicked upward only when commanded. Their hands trembled as they poured wine. Their backs flinched at sudden movement. One girl in particular caught his attention, Elsa. Mute, thin, scarred around the mouth, She had been at the convent for 4 years, no record of visitors, no letters, no voice. When Matias offered her a holy medal, she did not take it. Instead, she handed him a small folded paper, a drawing. It showed a figure in white, towering over flames, surrounded by kneeling girls with empty eyes. The figure's face was not human, it was all teeth. Disturbed, Matias began to ask questions. Elizabeth answered each with grace. Discipline, she said, obedience. The world doesn't understand our path. But Matias was not satisfied. That night, he broke into the crypt below the convent. What he found ended his faith in silence. The walls were etched with verses rewritten in Elizabeth's hand, scripture twisted into mantras of pain. He who suffers most shines brightest. The tongue is sin, the scream is salvation. Crucifixes were inverted, kneelers lined with nails, hooks suspended from the ceiling above stained stones, and in a hidden chamber, a ledger, names, dates, punishments. Many of the names were crossed out. Matias fled before dawn, taking the ledger. He ran to the bishop's court, demanding an inquest. But the church moved slowly, and Elizabeth did not. She sensed the breach, and she responded. The season of reckoning began. Girls were stripped of their blankets. Food was withheld. Speaking became a mortal sin. They were made to kneel on glass, write prayers in blood, burn their hair in fires lit for purification. A girl named Helena mispronounced a Latin word during Mass. Elizabeth ordered her hands broken with the altar's marble chalice. Another nun, Sister Agnes, confessed her doubt in confession. The next day, her body was found floating in the convent well, her wrists tied with rosary beads. The girls stopped hoping for rescue. They no longer cried at night. They simply endured. And above them, Elizabeth preached, "I will burn away your flesh until only your soul remains." Snow fell on the convent roof like ash. Winter came early that year, and with it silence. The girls no longer asked questions. They moved like shadows, eyes to the floor, hands folded like corpses. Elizabeth had turned discipline into gospel, and obedience into liturgy. Each punishment now came with scripture. Each scar, a verse. The crypt had become her temple. Elizabeth no longer joined the others in the main chapel. Her prayers were held in the undercroft, a cavern of carved angels, blackened by candle smoke and soot. She would descend nightly, alone or with a chosen girl, whispering chants in a tongue older than Latin. The others only heard fragments. Purgatio, Lumen, Corpus. She called it the chapel of correction, but the girls called it hell. One night the bells rang at an hour they shouldn't. The girls were awoken, led barefoot to the sanctum. The air smelled of salt and vinegar, a mixture once used to clean wounds. There they found Helena, the girl whose hands had been broken, bound to the crucifix with leather straps. Elizabeth stood beside her with a branding iron glowing red. "This is mercy," she said. The brand hissed as it touched Helena's chest. She didn't scream, only wept. That same week, the priests returned, not for blessing, but for judgment. The bishop had finally listened. Father Matias came with them, pale and weary, holding the ledger like a weapon. They knocked at the gates and demanded entry. Elizabeth, calm as ever, opened them herself. She welcomed them into her house with soft words and honeyed wine. "It is a joy to be seen," she said. But something was off. The walls were too clean. The air smelled of lavender. The girls were dressed in pristine habits, their faces blank, trained. Father Matias tried to speak to them, but they wouldn't meet his eyes. Elsa, the mute girl, passed by without a flicker of recognition. The other girls moved as one, choreographed like dancers, conditioned like soldiers. Still, the priests searched. They examined the upper halls, the dormitories, the kitchens. They found nothing, until one of the youngest girls, trembling and sickly, slipped Matias a piece of torn cloth. It was soaked in blood. That night, Matias and the bishop descended into the undercroft. What they found broke the last of their faith. The chapel had been emptied of saints. The altar bore no cross, only a throne made of bone and scorched wood. Chains hung from the ceiling like vines. The walls were covered in carvings, not of Christ but of angels with blades for wings. The air was thick with rot and incense, and in the corner beneath a veil of white cloth, a basin still steamed. The ledger had not lied. Then came the fire. From the rear of the convent, black smoke rose, thick, oily, unnatural. Screams echoed up the stairwells. The soldiers charged, but by the time they reached the chapel, the throne was aflame. No body, no sound, only the ashes of cloth and bone. Elizabeth had vanished. Some claimed they saw her flee into the forest. Others believed she had hidden herself beneath the crypt, waiting, biding. But when they searched, there were no tunnels, no exits, no footprints, only a final message, scrawled on the altar wall in blood: Sanguis, Lux, Redemptio, blood, light, redemption. The priests ordered the chapel sealed, the convent closed. The surviving girls, what few remained, were taken to distant abbeys, sworn to silence. But silence, once broken, never truly returns. In the months that followed, strange reports came from nearby villages: girls waking in the night, weeping blood, bells ringing where no church stood, a woman in gray robes seen standing at the forest's edge watching, and in one final chilling discovery, hunters found a body in the ruins of an old forest chapel. The face was gone, eaten by crows or something older, but the rosary in its hand bore the crest of Elizabeth's house, and above the altar, scratched into rotting wood, were 3 words: She showed us the way. The doors of St. Agidia no longer creaked. They groaned, swollen with winter and silence. When the bishop's soldiers returned weeks later, they came not to interrogate but to cleanse. What they found was not a convent, it was a mausoleum of prayer and rot. Snow drifted through broken stained glass. The walls dripped not with rainwater but condensation so thick it resembled tears. Inside the crypt, everything had been abandoned in haste: chalices spilled, pages torn, a single silver shoe left by the altar. But it was what they found beneath the altar that froze their souls. A trapdoor, sealed with wax and iron nails, cracked open under the weight of holy water and a crowbar. The chamber beneath was no longer a chapel, it was a theater of silence. Girls were chained to the walls, some alive, some only barely. Pale, bone-thin, lips trembling from recited verses etched into their memory. One girl smiled as the soldiers cut her free, whispering, "We are forgiven now." The throne was still there, soaked in blood, its seat sagging with age and flesh. Around it, basins were arranged in perfect circles. Inside them, scorched skin, fingernails, bones no thicker than a sparrow's. The walls told a gospel of agony. Saints painted not with halos but with knives for hands and blindfolds soaked in red. They found her journal too. It had no title, just the same phrase repeated on every page: "Through pain the veil is lifted." And her Bible, warped with heat, pages stuck together with wax and blood, was left open to a single verse, underlined with something dark: "I will show you the way, even through fire." Elizabeth was not there. Some said she escaped into the woods, running barefoot into the snow, never to be seen again. Others claimed she was burned alive in the flames she set herself, a martyr to her own monstrous gospel. But the truth came weeks later, when woodsmen found a body kneeling in the ruins of a remote chapel. The face was gone, chewed away by time or teeth, but the rosary in her fist bore the crest of her noble house. She had died praying, or performing. Above the crumbling altar, carved in jagged Latin, 3 words greeted them: Sanguis, Lux, Redemptio, blood, light, redemption. Yet the horror didn't end there. When the convent was emptied, the Vatican ordered its sealing. No exorcism, no blessing, just silence. The girls who survived were scattered across Europe, some in monasteries, others in asylums. The stories they carried were too dark to record, too real to forget, but the walls still whispered. Villagers claimed to see lights flickering in the crypt after midnight. Bells rang in storms without wind. And sometimes, when the snow melted too early, red pooled at the base of the old chapel, staining the stones like blood from a reopened wound. One night, a child who wandered too close returned mute, her palms pressed together in prayer, her tongue cut clean from her mouth. When asked what happened, she only wept and held up 3 fingers. 3 words, 3 wounds, 3 warnings. They say Elizabeth is gone, but the veil she tore open never closed. They sealed the records, burned the confessions, declared the surviving girls disturbed and the nuns misguided. The Vatican wrapped the truth in velvet silence, and the noble houses of Europe scrubbed Elizabeth's name from every genealogy. But history remembers in whispers. No sainthood was ever granted, no martyrdom proclaimed. Only the ruins remained, hollow, blackened, still damp from the prayers that had rotted through stone. The convent of St. Agidia was left to the moss and the crows, but even decay could not silence it. Locals refused to walk past its gates. Children were told it was haunted, cursed, forbidden. And yet, every few years, one would vanish, drawn by something older than curiosity. They'd return changed, or not at all. In the winter months, hikers speak of a woman in gray watching from the trees, her face hidden in the folds of her veil. Tourists report hearing hymns from empty rooms. And once in 1972, A film crew that entered the chapel for a documentary found the phrase Sanguis Lux, Redemptio, freshly etched into the floorboards, the wood around it still smoking. What Elizabeth of Palatinate believed has been debated for centuries. Was she mad? Possessed? A fanatic priestess to some ancient pre-Christian god? Theologians call her a perversion of Christ. Psychologists call her a case study in power and trauma. Survivors called her something simpler. They called her mother. Because she did not rule with love. She ruled with certainty and offered herself as both tormentor and redeemer. To some she was punishment, to others salvation. But all agreed on one thing: she did not follow God, she followed something older, and it followed her back. Now the convent is little more than bones and soot, but on nights when the moon is too bright and the air smells of wax and wet stone, pilgrims still come, some to pray, some to look, some because they hear a voice calling them by name. If you go, be warned, do not kneel, do not whisper, and above all, do not answer when she speaks.